At 7:30 a.m. on January 5th, 1943, Lieutenant Red Cochran stood in the Fire Control Center of the USS Helena, gazing as four Japanese Val dive bombers pulled away from his cruiser following a bombing run near Guadalcanal. At 31 years old, with 12 months of continuous sea duty under his belt, he had yet to notch a single kill with the Navy's brand new experimental shells. The enemy planes were already 2 miles out of range, far beyond the reach of the cruiser's 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Back in October, the Helena had taken on 500 rounds of this cutting-edge ammunition, each shell carrying a staggering price tag of $732. These were the Navy's top-secret variable time, VT fuses, a technology so classified it was practically a forbidden topic. Traditional 5-inch anti-aircraft rounds forced gunners to do the impossible: calculate exactly where an enemy plane would be 3 seconds into the future, set a mechanical timer on each shell, and pray for a hit. The math was ruthless. In 1942, over the Pacific Theater, American ships fired an average of 2,000 rounds just to shoot down a single Japanese aircraft. That morning, Cochran had watched bomber crews load the mysterious new shells, each fuse packed with a tiny radio transmitter, a receiver, 5 glass vacuum tubes, a battery triggered by the shock of firing, and 130 delicate electronic components, all squeezed into a space no bigger than a Coke bottle. The Navy had imposed a strict ban on using these fuses over land. If the Japanese recovered even one dud, they could reverse engineer the technology and turn it against the Allies. But 2 miles off the coast of Guadalcanal, over deep water, the risk was deemed acceptable. When the fire control officer relayed the target solution, Cochran's battery trained their 5-inch guns on the lead Val bomber, which was already diving toward the horizon. Standard naval doctrine screamed to hold fire, save the precious ammo for the next incoming attack. But Cochran had his orders: test the new fuses in real combat. This was the moment of truth. 3 gun captains stood at the ready, and Cochran gave the command. The first salvo roared at 7:32 a.m. 3 shells fitted with conventional time fuses. They detonated 1,000 feet behind the target, and the Val kept right on flying. Then came the second salvo, 3 more shells, this time equipped with the experimental radio proximity fuses. Through his binoculars, Cochran watched the rounds arc toward the bomber 2.5 miles away. No dramatic bursts, no clouds of black shrapnel like the time fuses produced. Just 3 silent projectiles streaking through the sky. Then in an instant, the Val's left wing tore away from its fuselage. The bomber flipped upside down and slammed into the ocean at 240 knots. From Cochran's order to the plane's fiery impact, just 18 seconds had passed. The gun crew stood frozen in silence. No cheers, no celebration, just stunned disbelief at the invisible destruction they'd just unleashed. If you want to uncover the mind-bending engineering behind how a radio could function inside a bullet traveling at 2,800 feet per second, hit that like button. It helps us share more of these forgotten stories about the scientists who redefined the rules of warfare. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe. We're just getting started with Cochran's story. As the remaining 3 Vals vanished over the horizon, Cochran stared at the splash where the bomber had crashed. His crew peppered him with questions. How did the shells know when to explode? Why didn't we see any blasts? What just happened? Cochran had no answers to give. The shells had been loaded by specialized technicians, and the fuse technology was classified far above his clearance level. All he knew were 3 facts. The shells had radios inside them. Those radios could detect targets, and the fuses worked. What Cochran didn't know was that 1,500 miles away, at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland, a physicist named Merle Tuve was waiting anxiously for a radio message, waiting to learn if 3 years of seemingly impossible engineering had finally paid off in combat, waiting to find out if those fragile vacuum tubes could survive 20,000 times the force of gravity and still work flawlessly. Because if the answer was yes, the scientists at Section T had just invented a weapon that would revolutionize naval warfare forever. That breakthrough, however, had its roots 5 months earlier, on August 12, 1942. On that day, the same team of scientists had convinced the U.S. Navy to scrap all other testing protocols after a jaw-dropping demonstration. Just 4 of their experimental shells had destroyed 3 radio-controlled target drones in Chesapeake Bay. The USS Cleveland, a newly commissioned light cruiser, was anchored in the bay for the weapons trial, armed with 12 5-inch anti-aircraft guns and 300 of the Navy Bureau of Ordnance's top-secret shells. Dr. Merle Tuve stood on the bridge beside the ship's gunnery officer. At 41 years old, he'd spent 3 years leading Section T at the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, overseeing a team of 200 scientists and engineers who were working on a weapon most of them thought could never be built. At 9 a.m., the first target appeared, a radio-controlled drone making a simulated torpedo run just above wave height. Standard Navy doctrine dictated that it would take 500 to 800 rounds to take down a maneuvering target like this. The Cleveland's crew had their orders: fire a maximum of 4 salvos, 12 shells total. If the drone survived, the test was over. The first salvo was launched at 9:03 a.m., 3 shells with the new proximity fuses. The drone was 800 yards away, closing in at 180 knots. Tuve watched through binoculars as the shells curved toward the target. No visible explosions. Then suddenly the drone's engine cut out. The aircraft nosedived and slammed into the water. Just 7 seconds had passed. The gunnery officer requested permission to fire again. A second drone was launched at 9:15 a.m., flying the exact same path and distance. The second salvo destroyed it in 6 seconds flat. The Navy had brought 6 drones to Chesapeake Bay for the test, operating under the assumption that hundreds of rounds would miss before a single hit was scored. 3 drones remained, and naval aviation insisted they were needed for other experiments. But Tuve begged for one more run. At 9:40 a.m., the third drone took off, simulating a level bombing run at 12,000 feet. The Cleveland's guns were elevated to their maximum range, and the third salvo was fired. The drone disintegrated midair at 11,800 feet. The test coordinator immediately called off the exercise. The Navy had just watched a light cruiser destroy 3 maneuvering targets with only 10 shells. But the story of those 10 game-changing shells began 2 years earlier, in August 1940. That's when Tuve received a classified briefing from the teasered mission, a team of British scientists who shared their preliminary research on proximity fuses, radio circuits small enough to fit inside an artillery shell. The British had managed to make the technology work in unguided rockets, which experienced low acceleration and gentle launch forces. But the Royal Navy needed fuses that could withstand the brutal conditions of being fired from 5-inch naval guns, 20,000 times the force of gravity upon launch, and 25,000 revolutions per minute from the gun's rifling. No vacuum tube in existence could survive that kind of punishment. The British wrote it off as impossible. American engineers at General Electric and RCA agreed. It couldn't be done. But Tuve studied the British circuit diagrams and told the National Defense Research Committee that he could have working prototypes ready in 6 months. He was wrong. It would take 18 grueling months of trial and error. The first hurdle was basic physics. A 5-inch shell accelerates from 0 to 2,800 feet per second in just 8 milliseconds, while the rifling spins it to 25,000 RPM to stabilize its flight. Any vacuum tube built with 1939 technology would shatter into dust on impact. Glass components would explode, filaments would snap, and circuit boards would disintegrate. And Tuve's team needed to fit 5 of these tubes inside every single shell. These tubes had to survive the launch, arm themselves after firing, transmit radio signals, receive reflections, calculate the distance to the target, and detonate at exactly 70 feet from the enemy, all while spinning fast enough to liquefy human tissue. The breakthrough came from a 26-year-old physicist who would later make history by discovering the Earth's radiation belts, James Van Allen. Van Allen joined Section T in October 1940, fresh off earning his PhD in physics from the University of Iowa. He had 0 experience working with vacuum tubes, but his assignment was clear and seemingly impossible: design glass tubes that could survive 20,000 Gs of force. Van Allen started by systematically destroying tubes. He mounted commercial radio tubes in metal casings and fired them from compressed air cannons. 98% shattered on impact. The 2% that survived couldn't handle the centrifugal forces From the shell's rapid spin, he tried mounting the tubes in rubber. They shattered. He tried springs. Shattered. He tried foam packing. Shattered again. For 6 months, every experiment ended with nothing but glass powder and twisted filaments. Then in March 1941, Van Allen had a breakthrough. He was collaborating with engineers at Raytheon in Massachusetts, who were working on miniaturizing hearing aid tubes. Tubes 1/10 the size of standard radio components. Van Allen realized that smaller tubes meant less mass, which meant lower stress forces during launch, which meant higher survival rates. He completely redesigned the tube's internal structure. He mounted every filament on thick steel wire instead of thin copper, reduced the glass envelope to its thinnest possible thickness, and encased the entire assembly in hard wax to distribute the shock of launch evenly. The new tubes were 3 inches long and half an inch in diameter, looking like oversized light bulb filaments sealed in tiny glass capsules. The first test was conducted at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in April 1941. Van Allen loaded 6 of the new tubes into dummy 5-inch shells and fired them. 4 shattered, 2 survived. A 33% survival rate. Not good enough. Van Allen went back to Raytheon, reinforcing the filament mounts, thickening the glass at high stress points, and adding compression springs at the base of each tube. The second test in June boosted the survival rate to 41%. By September, it hit 52%. By January 1942, the survival rate climbed to 58%. Good enough for the Navy to give the green light. Production contracts were awarded to Sylvania Electric, which hired 10,000 workers, mostly women, to assemble the miniature tubes by hand. Each tube required 42 individual operations: wire cutting, glass blowing, filament mounting, and vacuum sealing. By late 1942, Sylvania was churning out 1 million tubes every 2.5 days. But surviving the launch was only the first problem. The tubes had to function flawlessly while spinning at 25,000 RPM. The battery had to activate on impact. The transmitter had to send out radio signals. The receiver had to pick up reflections from the target, and the entire system had to calculate the distance and detonate at exactly the right moment. The battery issue nearly derailed the entire project. Standard dry cell batteries had a shelf life of just 6 months, useless for the Navy, which needed shells that could sit in storage magazines for years. Tuve's team came up with a clever solution: a wet cell battery that activated only when fired. It used a glass ampule filled with electrolyte fluid. The shock of launch shattered the ampule, and centrifugal force pushed the fluid into stacked plates, triggering a chemical reaction that generated electricity. It was a brilliant, low-tech fix. The National Carbon Corporation spent 8 months perfecting the ampule design. Glass too thick wouldn't shatter on firing, too thin, and it would break during handling. The final design used borosilicate glass walls exactly 0.015 inches thick, thin enough to break on launch, strong enough to survive rough handling aboard ship. By the summer of 1942, all the pieces were in place: vacuum tubes that could survive launch, batteries that activated on firing, transmitters that sent signals, and receivers that detected targets. Tuve assembled the first complete Mark 32 proximity fuses in July, and on August 12th, the USS Cleveland's test proved they worked. But Tuve knew a critical secret the Navy didn't. The fuses had a 52% failure rate. 48% of the shells fired would be duds. And if the Japanese recovered even one working fuse, they would have the circuit diagrams for America's most secret weapon. In October 1942, at the Mare Island Naval Ammunition Depot in California, 5,000 VT fuse shells sat in wooden crates marked with red diagonal stripes. Top secret, no exceptions. Each crate had bold block letter instructions: do not drop, do not stack above 3 crates high, do not expose to temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Commander William Parsons, a 35-year-old naval ordnance expert who would later arm the atomic bomb aboard the Enola Gay, supervised the loading process. His orders from the Bureau of Ordnance were crystal clear: deliver the shells to the South Pacific, train gun crews, observe their combat performance, and recover any duds. That last instruction was non-negotiable. If a VT fuse landed intact on Japanese-held territory, enemy engineers could reverse engineer the technology in 3 months, and Japanese anti-aircraft guns would gain the same deadly advantage over American aircraft. The Joint Chiefs of Staff established an ironclad rule. VT fuses could only be used over deep water, water where dud shells would sink beyond recovery. The South Pacific qualified, the Mediterranean qualified, the English Channel qualified. Everywhere else was strictly forbidden. Parsons loaded the shells aboard the USS Wright, an aircraft tender converted into an ammunition transport. The ship departed Mare Island on October 18 and arrived in Noumea, New Caledonia, on November 2nd. Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific area, met Parsons at the dock, reviewed the Chesapeake Bay test results, 3 drones destroyed with 10 shells, and asked which ships should get the ammunition first. Parsons recommended the aircraft carriers Enterprise and Saratoga, which had the largest air defense batteries and the highest chance of enemy contact. Halsey agreed, but he added one more ship to the list, the USS Helena. The Helena had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor, taking a torpedo hit that killed 20 men, spent 4 months in dry dock, and returned to the Pacific in June 1942. Her crew had fought through 6 months of brutal Guadalcanal operations. They knew Japanese tactics, they knew Japanese aircraft, and they were desperate for better ammunition. The statistics told a grim story. In October 1942, American ships in the South Pacific fired 36,000 rounds of 5-inch ammunition at Japanese aircraft, shooting down just 58 planes. That was an average of 621 rounds per kill, a rate that was completely unsustainable. The Navy was burning through ammo faster than factories could produce it. The Helena received 500 VT fuse shells on November 8th. Her gun crews were given a special briefing. The shells contained classified technology, cost $732 each, compared to $12 for standard ammo, could only be fired over deep water, and any dude that failed to detonate had to be reported immediately. The briefing didn't explain how the fuses worked. Crew members weren't told about the radio transmitters, the vacuum tubes, Van Allen's testing, Tuve's calculations, or the high failure rate. All they were told was that the shells would explode automatically near the target. That was all they needed to know. Commander Parsons stayed aboard the Helena through November and December, watching the gun crews train, reviewing ammunition handling procedures, and waiting for the chance to test the fuses in combat. Japanese air attacks came weekly during the Guadalcanal campaign, but the Helena was never in the right position to use the new ammo. The Enterprise and Saratoga waited too. No opportunities for live-fire testing. Then, on January 4, 1943, the Helena departed Lunga Harbor as part of Task Group 67.2, 4 cruisers, 4 destroyers, with a mission to bombard Japanese positions at Munda Airfield on New Georgia. Intelligence reports predicted a Japanese air response within 24 hours. At 4 a.m. on January 5th, Lieutenant Cochran's gun crews loaded the VT fuse shells into the ready racks. By 7 a.m., the Helena's 5-inch guns had fired 200 rounds of standard ammunition, bombarding Munda. The crew was tired, the gun barrels were hot, and 4 Japanese Val dive bombers were inbound from Rabaul. The Vals attacked at 7:28 a.m., using standard Japanese dive bomber tactics, splitting into 2 formations, with 2 aircraft targeting the Helena and 2 going after the New Zealand cruiser Achilles. The bombers dove from 8,000 feet at a 70-degree angle. The Helena's 40mm and 20mm guns opened fire at 3,000 feet, filling the sky with tracer rounds. One Val pulled up, the other released its bomb, which hit the Achilles amidships, killing 17 crew members. The Val then climbed away at full throttle. The Helena's gun directors tracked the retreating bomber, 2 miles out and moving farther away, 1,500 feet altitude, 200 knots speed, climbing at a 15-degree angle. Every single parameter was a nightmare for standard time fuses. The bomber was accelerating, the range was increasing, the altitude was changing. Any mechanical timer set at that moment would detonate either too early or too late. Lieutenant Cochran ordered the VT fuse shells loaded. 3 guns, 3 shells per gun, 9 rounds total. The first salvo was fired at 7:32 a.m. using standard timed fuses. The detonations appeared 1,000 feet behind the target, and the VAL kept flying. Then came the second salvo, 3 VT fused shells. Cochran watched the projectiles arc toward the bomber. No visible bursts, no puffs of black smoke. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the VAL's left wing folded upward. The bomber snapped into an inverted spin and slammed into the ocean 2 miles from the Helena. The gun crew stood silent, stunned by a sight that defied every principle of naval gunnery they'd ever learned. Commander Parsons stood beside Cochran in the fire control center, witnessing the same miracle. Shells that vanished into the sky, a bomber that disintegrated midair. No visible explosions. Parsons knew exactly what had happened. The VT fuses had worked, detonating within 70 feet of the target, close enough for shrapnel to tear the bomber's wing apart. But the bursts were invisible at 2 miles distance. That night, Parsons wrote the action report. First combat kill with VT fuses. Target D3A, Type 99 dive bomber. Range 4,200 yards. Altitude 1,500 feet. Ammunition expended 3 VT fuse shells. Result, target destroyed. The report was sent to Admiral Halsey, who forwarded it to Pearl Harbor, which sent it to Washington, D.C., which delivered it to Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Merle Tuve received the message on January 7th, 2 days after the combat action. The communication was short and sweet. Helena, January 5th, 1 kill, 3 rounds. Tuve read it 3 times, then walked to the Section T workshop and told his engineers that the fuses had worked in combat. The reaction was subdued. The scientists knew the statistics. 3 shells fired, 1 kill, a 0.33 kill rate. Impressive compared to standard ammo, but the sample size was too small. 1 engagement, 1 target, 1 kill. They needed more data. The data came flooding in. The Helena remained on station near Guadalcanal throughout January, and Japanese air attacks continued. Her gun crews used VT-fused ammunition in 4 more engagements. 2 kills with 8 rounds on January 9th, 1 kill with 6 rounds on January 15th, 1 kill with 4 rounds on January 23rd, 3 kills with 15 rounds on January 29th. For the entire month of January 1943, the Helena destroyed 8 Japanese aircraft with just 36 VT-fused rounds, an average of 4.5 shells per kill. Standard 5-inch ammunition averaged 621 rounds per kill. The VT fuse was 138 times more effective. The Navy immediately ramped up production orders. Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati was contracted to make 15,000 fuses per day. RCA expanded its facilities. Eastman Kodak joined the program. By March 1943, American factories were producing 40,000 VT fuses daily. By June, that number hit 70,000. But the ban on using fuses over land remained in place. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, refused to lift the restriction. Too much risk, too much investment. If 1 fuse landed intact on enemy territory, the entire program would be compromised. Then on December 16, 1944, Germany launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, the largest offensive on the Western Front since D-Day. In the Ardennes forest of Belgium, 3 German armies totaling 30 divisions and 250,000 men launched a surprise attack. Their objective, split the Allied forces, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. At 5:30 a.m., American forward positions reported massive artillery barrages. German infantry advanced through heavy fog, followed by panzer tanks. Within 12 hours, German forces had penetrated 15 miles into American lines. The weather was brutal. Heavy cloud cover grounded Allied air support, leaving American artillery as the only available counterattack option. On December 18th, General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, reviewed the situation at Chef Headquarters. American forces were outnumbered, air support was impossible, and artillery was critical. Eisenhower asked his ordnance staff about the VT fuses, the shells that had decimated Japanese aircraft in the Pacific, turning near misses into guaranteed kills. The answer was a firm no. VT fuses were still under embargo, forbidden for use over land, too risky for enemy recovery. Admiral King's directive still stood. Pacific theater only, deep water only. Eisenhower overruled him. On December 18, 1944, 200,000 VT-fused artillery shells were released for immediate deployment to Europe. The embargo was lifted. American artillery batteries could now fire the fuses over enemy-held territory. The risk was deemed acceptable because German forces were in full retreat everywhere except the Ardennes. Even if they recovered a dud fuse, they lacked the industrial capacity to mass produce it. The shells arrived at forward artillery positions on December 20th. Gun crews received emergency briefings. The fuses would detonate automatically at a preset height above the ground, typically 10 to 15 feet, creating a cone of shrapnel that rained down on targets below. Perfect for decimating infantry and unarmored vehicles in open terrain. General George Patton's Third Army received 50,000 rounds. Patton's artillery battalions were racing north to relieve American forces surrounded at Bastogne. The weather finally cleared on December 23rd, allowing Allied air support to resume, but Patton's artillery had already arrived. Colonel George Axelson commanded the 406th Artillery Group, supporting the 38th Cavalry Squadron near Mannheim. German infantry were advancing through open ground, and standard artillery doctrine called for contact fuses that detonated on impact, effective against fortifications, but useless against dispersed infantry. Impact fuses created craters, with shrapnel flying sideways and upward. Soldiers in trenches or behind cover survived easily. Axelson ordered his VT fuses set for a 12-foot detonation height. His batteries opened fire at 9 a.m. on December 23rd. The first shells detonated above the advancing German column, and shrapnel rained down from the sky. No cover was effective. Trenches didn't matter. Trees didn't matter. The Germans were caught completely exposed. After-action reports documented 72 German casualties from a single 20-minute artillery barrage using just 800 VT-fused rounds. The German advance ground to a halt. Survivors refused to leave their bunkers during subsequent barrages. Patton witnessed similar results near the Sauer River on December 26th. German forces attempting to cross the river were hit with VT-fused artillery, with shells detonating 15 feet above the water. Shrapnel swept both riverbanks, and the crossing failed miserably. That night, Patton wrote to the War Department with a short, direct message. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating. We caught a German battalion trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new method of warfare. I am glad that you all thought of it first." By January 1945, American artillery had fired 5 million VT-fused shells in Europe. German prisoners described the attacks as impossible to defend against. No fortification held, no cover was adequate. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical casualties. But the VT fuse's greatest contribution was still unfolding in the Pacific, where Japanese forces had developed a desperate new tactic to counter American naval supremacy: kamikaze attacks. On October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet, issued orders to his remaining pilots. Standard dive bombing and torpedo attacks were no longer effective. American radar detected incoming aircraft 60 miles away. Combat air patrols intercepted bombers before they reached the fleet, and American anti-aircraft fire, now equipped with VT fuses, destroyed any planes that broke through the defensive screen. Onishi's solution was horrifically simple. Pilots would deliberately crash their bomb-laden aircraft into American ships, guaranteeing a hit and maximum damage. The tactic was called Shinpu, divine wind. Americans called it kamikaze. The first organized kamikaze attack occurred on October 25th, when 13 Mitsubishi Zero fighters loaded with bombs attacked escort carriers off Samar. 5 carriers were hit, 1 sank. The tactic worked because kamikaze pilots didn't need to survive. They just needed to reach their target. American gun directors faced a new problem. Standard intercept doctrine assumed aircraft would take evasive action when fired upon, allowing gunners to calculate lead angles based on the plane's escape route. Kamikazes didn't evade. They flew straight at their targets. The calculations were simpler, but the closing speed was faster, and the consequences of missing were catastrophic. VT-fused ammunition became critical. Standard time fuses required gunners to predict the intercept point 3 seconds in advance. Kamikazes changed course constantly in their final approach, making those predictions useless. VT fuses eliminated the need for prediction. They detonated automatically when they detected the target. The effectiveness data was staggering. Between October 1944 and August 1945, American ships in the Pacific fired VT-fused ammunition at 278 kamikaze aircraft. Analysis showed that only 46 of those planes would have been destroyed using standard time fuses. The VT fuse increased the kill rate by 600%. The Battle of Okinawa demonstrated the full scale of the kamikaze threat. Between April and June 1945, Japanese forces launched over 1,500 kamikaze attacks against the American fleet, sinking 26 ships, damaging 164 more, and killing 4,900 American sailors, more casualties than any previous naval campaign in the Pacific. VT fuses couldn't stop every kamikaze. The aircraft were too fast, the approach too direct, but they boosted defensive effectiveness enough to prevent catastrophic fleet losses. Destroyers on radar picket duty fired VT-fused ammunition almost exclusively. Their survival depended on it. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyer squadrons in the Pacific, later described the impact. When VT fuses became standard ammunition, kill rates against kamikaze aircraft doubled. Ships that would have been overwhelmed survived. The mathematical advantage shifted back to the defenders. By the end of the war, American factories had produced 22 million VT fuses, with the total program cost exceeding $1 billion in 1945 currency. Over 100 factories were involved in production. Sylvania alone employed 10,000 workers manufacturing the miniature vacuum tubes. The program consumed 3% of all physicists in the United States. The fuses were used in 5-inch naval guns, Army artillery ranging from 75 millimeters to 240 millimeters, British naval guns, and experimental rocket applications. They shot down Japanese aircraft over the Pacific, devastated German infantry in the Ardennes, and defended London against V-1 flying bombs with a 79% kill rate. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal called it the weapon that helped blaze the trail to Japan. General George Patton said it required a complete revision of land warfare tactics. Vannevar Bush, director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, credited the proximity fuse with 3 significant effects on the outcome of the war. And it all started with one impossible engineering challenge. Put a radio inside a bullet. Make it survive forces that would crush a human body. Make it work while spinning fast enough to tear steel apart. Then build 22 million of them. Merle Tuve never received public recognition for his work during the war. The VT fuse program remained classified until September 1945. He returned to the Carnegie Institution, continued his research in geophysics, and died in 1982. His obituaries mentioned the proximity fuse only in passing. James Van Allen became famous in 1958 for discovering the Earth's radiation belts, now known as the Van Allen belts. But few people knew he'd spent a year perfecting glass tubes that could survive 20,000 times the force of gravity. Lieutenant Red Cochran survived the war and left the Navy in 1946. Official records never mentioned that he fired the first VT fuse shells in combat. That information remained classified for 3 years. The USS Helena was sunk at the Battle of Kula Gulf on July 6, 1943, hit by Japanese torpedoes and sinking in just 20 minutes, with 168 crew members killed. Her wreck was discovered in 2018, resting 300 feet below the surface in the Solomon Islands. The technology didn't end with World War II. Modern anti-aircraft missiles, from the Patriot missile to the Standard missile to the AIM-54 Phoenix, all use radar proximity fuses. The principles developed by Section T still protect naval vessels today. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do us a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about scientists and engineers who saved lives with vacuum tubes, radios, and impossible engineering. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Merle Tuve, James Van Allen, and the entire Section T team don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.